Hey guys, welcome to our first plenary speaker of the day. I think our only plenary speaker of the day, Sarah Brito from Good Food Media Networks. We're going to just let people kind of roll on in here, Sarah, and we'll let you get started without too much more time ticking off. So, as promised in the pre-production, that the early audience caught the very, very last seconds of. So there's a little behind the scenes for y'all. I told Sarah that I would mention Rosen PR Group, and we have a couple of their lovely folks on the line with us. And they, frankly, I mean, Rosen has been awesome in terms of supporting the symposium. They connected us to several of our speakers, several people that we wound up not being able to have room for, because as most of you know who've been watching, we have a ton of content this week. But just big shout out to Rosen Group PR for their help with the Cannabis Sustainability Symposium based in New York, and they work all over the country. They're really nice people. So with that, let me introduce Sarah Brito, who is here in Colorado, in Boulder, but is a lady of the world. She's lived in New York for a long time. She's worked at big brands. She's worked on all kinds of cool stuff. She's doing really fascinating work now where she's helping identify restaurants that have high quality ingredients and basically promoting them to the world. So when she and I first spoke, I was like, wow, I love what you're doing. We're trying to do something similar in cannabis and help people understand where to get the best quality stuff. So there was an immediate affinity on my part. And so I'm so thrilled to introduce Sarah Brito and her plenary session. Sarah, take it away. I will stay on mic as requested, but I'm going to dip out of here on camera.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Ben, for that very lovely introduction. I too am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here, but I also thought that I should start with a confession, actually a funny story about my relationship with cannabis when I moved to Colorado 12 years ago. And then a bit of a confession. But my quick story was when I moved to Colorado from New York City. I had never owned a car before. So I was at the DMV registering my car, and they were about to hand me my license plate. And the woman behind the DMV counter started laughing. And she said, "Oh, I can't give you that license plate." And I said, "Why?" And she held it up to me and it said 420 shy. And she started laughing. And I just said, "I don't get it." And she's like, 420 shy. You can't drive around in Colorado with a license plate that says 420 shy. So the fact that I didn't even know what that meant in 2008 gives you a little bit of an idea of my relationship with your industry. Clearly, I'm a newbie and a novice. But that said, there are a tremendous amount of connections between food and cannabis, as I've been learning over the last 12 years. And in fact, in preparation for this conversation today, I reached out to a few of my colleagues, and some of whom worked in good food prior to working in cannabis. And when I reached out to the first person, I was really struck by her first response when I said, "I'm giving a talk on what cannabis can learn from good food. And I'm wondering if you have any insights that you'd like to share with me based on your experience in both good food and cannabis." And her immediate response was, "Oh my God, every day when I go to work, it's like deja vu of the early days of good food." So with that, I knew that this was an extremely relevant topic. So kudos to Ben and to Zach for having the foresight to invite me to speak and to include this topic in the conference today. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. As I said to Ben, I've only done this once, so give me a second here to make sure I can get it to work. And I think this is going to be it. Let's see. And so I think that you all, we're good?
Yep.
All right, awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
Before we jump into the topic at hand, I said that I had those stories to share with you. But I also feel like I need to confess something to everyone here. And let's see if I can get the next slide to come up. Yes, okay. The confession is that I haven't always worked in good food. My background and experience is actually in brand strategy and marketing, e-commerce, and retailing with creative agencies and Fortune 100 and 500 companies. And that includes big food brands like Domino's and Kraft. And I think since we're based here in Colorado, I should say Kraft as in the macaroni and cheese, not craft beer. I've also worked with Vail Resorts. In fact, I conceived the idea for what became Epic Mix app, which some of you, if you're skiers and snowboarders, might have that app on your phone. And I spent many years working on the American Express brand. But as Ben introduced me, I'm also the co-founder of the Good Food Media Network, the publisher of the Good Food 100 Restaurants List and Industry Impact Report. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit that I co-founded in 2016, along with Jeff Hermanson and a group of leading chefs in Colorado and across the country. And we created this organization to challenge the status quo in the culinary community and to celebrate the people and businesses changing the food system for good. Prior to this, just to give you a little bit more context for my connection to good food, I collaborated with Kimball Musk, yes, that's Elon's brother, to create the Next Door American Eatery brand. And I led brand strategy for the national rollout of Snooze, an AM eatery. Again, if you're not familiar with these brands, they're two brands that were co-founded, or rather founded, right here in Colorado, and are both moving across the country. So I'm here today to share my insights on this topic of what cannabis can learn from good food, both from a brand strategy and a good food perspective. So jumping in, taking the approach of a brand strategist, in order to understand and identify the opportunities for what cannabis can learn from good food, we need to begin by looking back at the origin of the good food movement. So here's my take on a short, not exact by any means, history of good food and some of the key milestone moments. And I'm gonna spend a few minutes on the slide because I think it's gonna be important for you as I'm going through some of the milestone moments to think about, you know, the grassroots milestone moments and the government policy moments, and how it was really a combination of these two that has led to where we are today. But in the 70s, the good food movement was really known as, which is often credited as the beginning of the modern day good food movement, was really known as the environmental movement or the back to the land movement. And some of the milestone moments here include the first Earth Day happening in 1970, 1973, when the US banned the pesticide DDT, when the Environmental Protection Agency was formed, when Greenpeace was formed, and when the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act were first passed. In the 80s, the movement evolved to become more known as the natural food movement. And for those of us of a certain age, we might remember the smell of those health and natural food stores in the 80s. In the late 70s, White Wave, a company headquartered right here in Broomfield, Colorado, and now owned by Danone, or as some of you might pronounce it, Dannon, you might know it as the yogurt company. But what you might not know is that Danone is one of the largest food companies in the world and is now the largest B Corp in the world. So White Wave was really a big part right here in Colorado of the founding and the beginnings of the natural food movement. The first fair trade label was also launched in the 80s. Moving into the 90s, this is when you start to see the rise of the organic movement. Clearly organics were happening in the natural food movement in the 80s, but it was in the 90s when the organic industry achieved $1 billion in revenue, an important milestone in the formation of any industry. The 90s is also when Alice Waters of Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, launched the first edible schoolyard. Moving into the new millennium in the 2000s, this is when we really see a growth from not just a movement, but to a legitimate industry. It's in, I believe, 2000 or 2001, the USDA finally authorized, after decades of work, the legal organic label. In the early 2000s, Slow Food, which was originally formed in Italy, started to move across the United States. I think it was in 2000 that I actually joined Slow Food New York City. In 2008, Slow Food launched the Slow Food Snail of Approval. That's actually something, in full disclosure, that I helped create and launch before leaving New York City to come to Colorado in 2008. In food, also in the early 2000s, Food Policy Action was formed by celebrity chef Tom Colicchio, that you might know from Top Chef. And that's a nonprofit organization that rates US congressmen based on their food voting records, and was trying to make food a political issue that we could evaluate our government representatives based on their voting records. The 2000s was also when I formed the Good Food 100 Restaurants in 2016. And in 2019, the James Beard Foundation actually launched a new tagline called Good Food for Good, and a new campaign in response to COVID-19 called #OpenForGood. I should also mention that Slow Food, even though they're still known as Slow Food, created a new tagline called Good, Clean, and Fair. So you start to see this movement towards good in this period of time. And here we are approaching on the eve of 2021, and regenerative seems to be the word, at least of the day, of the year. But I think it's still early to tell whether this is a moniker or a name that gains traction in the mainstream to sort of define the next phase of the movement. So that's where we've been. So where are we today? The short headline here is that we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. The good news is that the organic industry has grown to become a $50 billion industry. The bad news is that it took 30 years, and organic food, using organic food sales as a proxy for the movement as a whole, still only make up approximately 5% of total food sales in the United States. So 30 years. Why is this? Well, there's a confluence of factors, as with any complex issue, that have impeded and continue to threaten the growth. And these are just a few of them. Again, I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide, just because some of these you might find applicable to the cannabis movement, but also I think it's just important to understand how there are environmental factors and government factors and marketing factors that can aid or impede growth. So clearly we have the threat of global climate change, specifically here in the US, our withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. We have extreme weather events. As Zach has said earlier, he is a fire refugee from Northern California, now at the symposium based in Vermont. And if you're not familiar with the statistics around California and food production, over 1/3 of the country's vegetables and 2/3 of the country's fruits and nuts are actually grown in California. So these extreme events, whether we're talking fires and hurricanes and floods, have dramatic and significant impact on food and our ability to move towards good food. Of course, we've got continued issues with air and water pollution, soil erosion, land use. Anyone notice a new housing development in a place that used to be owned by private families and independent farmers? I know I do when I bike out in the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado. In just the short time I've lived here, so much farmland has been transitioned into suburban housing developments. Of course, we've got US government rollbacks of environmental protection legislation. We have government subsidies that continue to subsidize big ag instead of small ag. We have factory farming and animal welfare issues that have created the threat of human antibiotic resistance. We have label confusion, something that I'm going to talk more about in a minute. We've also got the increasing average age of farmers and the fact that not enough new young farmers want to get into the business. And they don't want to get into the business probably because of the next bullet point, which is farmer bankruptcy. And so on top of all of that, we have farmer mental health issues. And if you're not aware, farmers are one of the most high risk populations in the United States, which as a whole, the United States is seeing an increase in suicide rates. But this rate is extremely alarming amongst farmers. So clearly a lot of issues. So now that we understand where we've been, we know where we are today, let's look forward. Let's use the rest of my time with you to talk about what cannabis can learn from good food, or more specifically, how you, as I'm sure many of you in the audience are working in your own or others' individual cannabis businesses, can build a good cannabis company and move the industry forward. So despite its shortcomings in its almost 50-year modern history, I do believe that there are several insights and ideas and principles or rules, if you will, that can be applied to the cannabis industry so that hopefully the sustainable cannabis movement continues to grow in momentum and can make a better impact on the world and hopefully much faster progress than we've been able to do in good food. So here are my so-called 12 rules of good food. And if you're a particularly rebellious person and you hate the idea of rules, just substitute the word idea or insight or principle. I was sort of modeling this after Michael Pollan's food rules. So I used the word rules. So rule number 1, follow the money. It's always about the money. Make money and do good. As one of my former board members used to say, the number 1 rule of running a sustainable business is to keep your door open. In other words, you have to make money in order to do good. In my personal opinion, making money should not be the sole purpose for doing what you do, but making money is certainly what enables you and your business to do good in the world. So my advice is don't make the mistake that some people in the good food movement have made, which is to let their sustainability ideals get in the way of making a shit ton of money. As one of my inspirations, Cindy Gallup, likes to say. So my question to you is, what company, who will become the Whole Foods of cannabis? Rule number 2, sustainability starts with relationships. We need to shift from a linear industrial commodity mindset to a circular, relational, life-centered mindset. Sustainability is literally about the vitality of an interconnected and interdependent ecosystem. So to care about sustainability, we have to relate to, we have to care about each individual link in the ecosystem and their distinct value and contribution to sustaining the system as a whole. So this leads to rule number 3. Rule number 3, if it's good for the community, it's good for us. We need to shift from a what's in it for me mindset to a what's in it for we mindset. This is because sustainability is rooted in the idea that no one link in the system can be healthy unless every link in the system is healthy. So how do you know if every link in the system is healthy? Well, this leads to rule number 4. Rule number 4, know your farmers, producers, purveyors, partners, and choose to work with like-minded, not necessarily local partners. In other words, choose to seek out working with partners who share your beliefs and values, even if they're not local. I say this because one of the reasons that I believe good food doesn't have to be local is that it just has to reflect rule number 2 and rule number 3. In this case, I'll just mention here these 2 brands, if you're not familiar with them from the good food world. Seattle Fish is not actually in Seattle. Seattle Fish is a Colorado-based sustainable seafood distributor. As you can see here from their tagline, we sustainably feed people. Sea to Table is a direct-to-consumer sustainable seafood company that was founded actually in Brooklyn, New York, and is still based in the Northeast. I like to refer to them as the Zappos of fish, because they deliver fish directly to your door wherever you are. It's actually how I choose to get my seafood here in Colorado. Okay. So moving on to rule number 5. Businesses, business practices and government policy are both important. It's really individual business practices and government policy working in conjunction that creates real progress in my mind. It's policy that creates the underlying conditions or the structure for business culture to thrive or die. And I should mention here that by culture, I'm simply referring to a way of doing something, like specific business practices. And it's structure that creates culture, but then it's culture that then has the power to influence and change structure. So it's really both that are important. It's not an either or. And in this case, these 2 examples, the left one being the James Beard Foundation's Chef's Boot Camp for Policy and Change, was formed recognizing the influence of individual chefs in trying to harness their power to influence policy at the state and national level. So these are actually boot camps that train individual chefs and restaurant owners to use their vote to lobby Washington. They're very actively doing this right now if you're following the HEROES Act that is up for vote in the Senate. The campaign on the right, Save Restaurants, is a campaign that was born literally 2 weeks after COVID-19, or I should say not after COVID-19, but after many governors ordered restaurants to close in mid-March. This campaign to save restaurants was formed to basically rally the industry together around the singular issue of restaurant relief. And never before had so many independent restaurants come together. So again, individual business practices matter, but coming together and harnessing that power to help move the industry forward, it also matters. To reinforce how important this rule is, I want to just share briefly this one cautionary tale from the good food movement. And that is that it is a very fractured movement with a proliferation of players working on a variety of issues, all serving different stakeholders. And the caution here is that that fractured nature of the movement really only helps big industrial commoditized factory food divide and conquer. The fractured nature of the movement also led Mark Bittman of the New York Times to question as recently as 2015 whether, quote, such a thing as the food movement exists. And the fact that this question still remains some 45 years into the movement, I think is a cautionary tale for all of you working within the sustainable cannabis movement. Rule 6, an open, transparent system is the new normal. This is because millennials' search for meaning demands that organizations move to full transparency. There is no doubt about it that being open and transparent is simply a requirement in business today. And research consistently reports that the majority of US consumers believe it is not just nice to know, but rather it is their right to know more about the ingredients in their food. And since cannabis is an intimate product like food, and by intimate, I simply mean something that we either put on or in our bodies. The brands that will win over millennials with full transparency. Rule 7, big is not necessarily bad. And regardless of size, choose to support independent versus industrial businesses. The brand represented here is Niman Ranch. And Niman Ranch is not just the name of it's not actually the name of a local ranch. If you're not familiar with Niman Ranch, it's actually a network of 750 independent family farmers across the country, mostly in the Midwest. And just because a company is bigger, to me, doesn't mean that it's bad. And actually, despite Niman Ranch's perceived size, in a good food movement that tends to idealize local, Niman Ranch really only represents less than 2% of the US pork industry. So to me, again, sustainability should be less about how big a company is and more about how it actually does business. In the case of Niman Ranch, it's how it raises hogs with independent family farmers. And they do that in a way to help keep farmers, farmland rather, in the hands of families and to help cultivate the next generation of young farmers. Rule 8, less is more. What's not in your product can be just as important as what is. In the example here, which is actually from my refrigerator last night, this Organic Valley half and half says it's 100% grass-fed, no grain, right smack dab in the front of the product. So whether a product says no grain, gluten-free, less salt, fill in whatever word you want, no, free, less, what's not in your product has become so important that it's no longer relegated to the USDA regulated label, nutrition label on the back. What's not in your product is now front and center and has become integral to the very definition of the brand itself. Rule 9, certifications can be a proxy for trust. They also create confusion. Create national regulated standards that create legitimacy and brand value. And when based on standards that truly make a difference, certifications can help establish legitimacy and they can enhance brand value, as the organic trade label has proven over and over again to add brand value to companies that go through the certification process and achieve the label. But I don't want to deny that label confusion is real. That's so important that I'm going to say it again. Label confusion is real. And confusion creates distrust and inertia, and both distrust and inertia are not good for sales. In fact, I would say that inertia is one of the greatest enemies of most brands. And I'm happy to speak more on that when we get into the Q&A. But speaking of front and center, rule number 10 is about people, not just ingredients. And this is really important because despite the fact that it took over 30 years for this idea to become central to the conversation in the good food movement, it's important to remember that in people, planet, profits focused companies, people come first. And as Pete Wells, restaurant critic for the New York Times, said in 2018, and I'm going to lean in here so I can read the fine print here. Something has gone grotesquely wrong when chefs brag that the chickens they have lived happy, stress-free lives, but they can't promise us that the women they employ aren't being insulted in the storage room. So very important. Rule number 11, awards can create credibility. They can also create risk, sort of that same double-sided issue with certifications. The Food Network gave rise to the celebrity chef, which made chefs icons and heroes of the culinary industry. And the James Beard Awards are often referred to as the Oscars of the culinary world. So my question to the cannabis industry is, who will be the celebrities, the heroes, and the icons of the sustainable cannabis movement? And my advice is that in the wake of the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements and the continued fight for access, equity, and justice, there is a real opportunity to learn from the mistakes of the Oscars and the James Beard Awards and to build a system of recognition and reward and the corresponding financial influence that comes along with that, that is truly open to all in the industry. Last, but certainly not least, rule number 12, actions matter. We can't just create great products. You must build valuable brands. Notice that only 2 of the 10 brands featured on the 2020 Forbes Most Valuable Brands list are actually food brands. And Coca-Cola and McDonald's certainly don't represent good food. So as I said earlier, there's a lot to learn from good food, but we too still have a long way to go. And for anyone who doubts the importance of branding to create real business value, I would like to share some food for thought. Brands are the new religion, like it or not. People are turning to them for meaning, and the brands that are successful are those with strong beliefs and original ideas. They are also the ones that have the passion and energy to change the world and to convert people to their way of thinking through outstanding communications. And these are just a few brands, both from food and not from food. But I'd also encourage you to Google this article. I meant to include it here, where in the wake of the lack of leadership in Washington regarding mask wearing in COVID-19, there was an article that talked about how brands like Starbucks and consumers are looking to brands for leadership, even in a global pandemic. And this is evident, again, whether you believe it or not, it is actually true. It's inherent in the language that people use when they talk about brands. You know, I worship Steve Jobs, I worship Elon Musk, I can't live without my Starbucks. That language that is integral to the way people speak about brands today is the language that used to only be reserved for religion and other once admired institutions. So what does success look like, and how will you know if you've succeeded? Well, you'll know you've started to succeed when sustainable cannabis is part of the pop culture conversation across the country. So think books like Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser, The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, all bestsellers. Movies, pop culture movies, not documentaries, like Food Inc., or not niche documentaries, I should say. Publicly traded companies like Chipotle, nationally known brands like Stonyfield that are now available in Walmart, and chef and celebrity icons like Alice Waters and Dan Barber. And when sustainable cannabis companies like these early pioneers of good food become household names and available at a local Walmart near you, as many of them are today. And lastly, you'll know you've really achieved success when people express their brand loyalty in ways that say, until death do us part, whether that's tattooing your logo on their body, choosing to plan their wedding at a cannabis farm, or choosing to get married in a coffin designed with, perhaps a cannabis plant on it. And if you don't think that's a good first step, I'd also add that, when people are willing to wear your swag, and if you can't see, I'm wearing my Good Food for All t-shirt. I have my Good Food 100 hat here, and we give all of our chefs this little pin to wear on their chef coats. So you might just think that it's swag, but swag is important because it shows that people are willing to wear your brand on their bodies, which is a sign of their passion and loyalty for how you're choosing to change the world. So in closing, what can the cannabis industry learn from good food? Ultimately, the word industry is just a man-made, made-up word for the way a group of people choose to view, value, and make meaning in the world. And like other industries, whether you talk about food, fashion, technology, cars, coffee, or cannabis, the cannabis industry has the power to change the world. With power comes responsibility. So I'd like to end by leaving you with a question. What kind of world do you want to create? What kind of world do you want to create? And my hope is that you'll join me in working to change the world for good. Thank you.
Wow. Sarah, if they could, I'm sure the audience would be on their feet applauding. That was awesome. I know I want to get a copy of your presentation, and I might be asking your permission to borrow some of the information. That was just amazing. And you can see in the chat, we've got some cheering at their desks. We do have a couple minutes. We have one good question here from Marcus Lockett in the Bay Area. Do you mind? Can we chat a little bit, Sarah? Do you mind?
Absolutely. I've got all the time in the world.
Awesome. Well, they're gonna boot us, and I'm gonna make sure that we participate in this booting at 40, so that we can get ready for the 10:45 slot, or the quarter of slot, because we're all over the country here. But Marcus's question I thought was right on, and of course my ears perked up when you're talking about certification and all that. Marcus asked, what types of sustainable or ethical labeling and claims would you like to see on cannabis products? Are there any that you've already seen?
It's a great question, and I know it's like the question of the day, not just because it personally is relevant to the Cannabis Certification Council, but because I think you're at a stage as at an industry where it's time to answer that question. But the reality is, I don't have a quick answer for you. What I would say from the Good Food Movement, I would love to. Ben, when you reached out to me, you really piqued my interest, because I would like to actually help the industry wrestle with this question. But I would say this from the good food perspective. It needs to be, when I said earlier that it needs to be based on meaningful difference, what I mean is it needs to be based on measurable, objective, meaningful differences. And so some of the labels that have lost meaning in good food, I'll say this to keep it succinct. If you look at the natural label that existed in the 80s, but has lost traction and is now considered meaningless, and Google it, you can read about it on Wikipedia. It's because it was not measurable. So if it's not measurable, then there's nothing objective to, no objective standards it can be based on. And again, that goes back to then just adding more confusion into the marketplace, which creates distrust. And when people don't know what label to trust, it creates inertia. And the most likely behavior any consumer is to make in any category, this is the $1 million question, the most likely behavior any consumer is going to do in any category is nothing.
Yes.
They are going to do nothing. So, and that is the worst thing for a brand.
So fascinating. And I've got a little, you mentioned swag, and I immediately went and grabbed a little swag. So I've got a "What's in my weed" sticker here. And, to me, and this is part of what we're doing at the council, and you're speaking exactly to this, where in this context, in this category, consumers really don't know at all what they're getting. And I think, part of what we have observed is that we need to help consumers start to think about just the very basic questions. And that's also why we're developing the organically grown cannabis standard, because we feel like there just needs to be a baseline of and an offering that is ubiquitous, that doesn't need a lot of context or explanation. All right, we are out of time. Sarah, I'm going to call you like in the next week or so, because I could just talk to you for hours, and I hope you'll give me half an hour, maybe. I don't know. Let's talk.
I think I was remiss in calling you back in August, so I promise we'll do virtual lunch or coffee or something.
Very good. Sarah Brito, thank you so much, from the Good Food Media Network. Wherever you are in the country, you can look up restaurants that are close to you on her website, and I encourage you to do so. And I'm personally optimistic that Sarah is going to help us in the industry grapple with some of these quality issues and education issues. So we got to go.